Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2025 economic update. So with the spring statement yesterday, hopefully the timing of today's session is just right. This has been a really popular webinar over the last few years, and we have a great number of members joining us again online today. So this is a great opportunity to hear from three of Northern Ireland's leading economists about the year ahead. They're going to give us some insights into the key issues affecting the local economy and examine what business and policymakers can do to address the challenges out there. So today we are delighted to be joined by Maureen O'Reilly, Conor Lamb and Gareth Hetherington. Maureen is an independent economist with more than 25 years experience across the public, private and third sectors, working on a wide range of research, impact and evaluation projects. She has a particular interest in the business economy, working with several local business bodies to understand performance, challenge and policy asks to support Northern Ireland businesses and the economy here. Maureen also works directly with the Ulster Society on our annual members survey, and she's done that for many years now, and she'll be sharing some of the findings from this year's survey in her session today. Conor is the chief economist at Danske Bank, and he's responsible for Danske's quarterly sectoral forecasts and consumer confidence index. Conor often speaks at business functions and with Danske Bank customers on his views around the UK and Northern Ireland economies. And Gareth is the director of the University of Ulster Economic Policy Centre. The centre carries out a broad range of economic policy focused research to inform government on key policy and strategy decisions. The centre is currently working with central government in the area of labour market research, skills development and competitiveness, and with local government in community planning and economic development strategies. Maureen, Conor and Gareth, thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to have you here and look forward to hearing your views and insights. All of our panellists are very happy to take questions from the audience, and we have extended today's session to allow extra time for that. But if we don't have the questions coming through, we'll give you the time back in the diaries. So please type your questions into the Q&A box. That's open. You can do that throughout the webinar. And we'll hand over to Conor and get kicked off. Conor, thank you.
Thank you, Gillian, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share some slides with you here. I'm going to give some reflections today on how the UK and Northern Ireland economy has been performing recently, and then discuss the outlook as we look into 2025 and 2026, drawing on our most recently published Northern Ireland Quarterly Sectoral Forecast report. I'll then conclude with some of the risks and uncertainties facing the economy as we look forward. So if I begin with the UK economy, I think it's fair to say that 2024 was really a year of two halves. So at the end of 2023, the economy entered into a technical recession with output falling, albeit by a small amount in the final two quarters of the year. But in 2024 Q1, we saw a very strong growth rate in the UK economic output levels. Q2 was still reasonable growth, but when we came into Q3 and Q4, the economy really stagnated. There was no increase in economic output in quarter three, and in quarter four, the economy grew only by 0.1%. So coming into 2025, the UK economy had lost a lot of the momentum that it had in the earlier part of the year. Now, in recent years, one of the big elements which has helped to constrain UK economic activity has been inflation. And I've plotted here the last number of months of inflation data. And I don't have February's, which was released yesterday in the chart. I'll cover that just as I speak here. But the blue bar here is the overall inflation rate. But if we look a level beneath that, we can draw some interesting insights as well. So the grey bar shows core inflation. And this is inflation when you exclude energy, food, alcohol, and tobacco. The reason that we do that is those items of the consumer price basket can be influenced by global factors. So the likes of energy and fuel can be heavily influenced by how those commodities are traded in global markets. So taking those out of the inflation calculation gives us more of a measure of perhaps domestic inflation. And services inflation is somewhat similar. It's a measure of underlying price pressure in the economy. Given that the UK economy is very much a services-driven economy, and this sector typically has less reliance on goods movements, it can be more indicative of price pressures resulting from domestic inflation and wage increases. Now, at the end of last year, the overall inflation rate had come down to around 2.5%, still above target, but was heading in the right direction. In January, it ticked up a little to 3%, and yesterday's data actually came down a little, low to 2.8%. But core and services inflation are still quite elevated. Core inflation's in and around 3.5%, and services inflation about 5%. Now, the good thing with this is that inflation rates are much lower than they were a couple of years ago. If we go back to 2022 and 2023, we were looking at annual inflation rates of around 9% and 7% respectively. So we are a good bit lower than that. That's a positive, but we're still considerably above the target. We're still a little bit above that 2%, and so there's still some squeeze coming on consumers from price pressures in the economy. Now, in Northern Ireland, our economic data is a little different to the wider UK, where we have GDP. What we have locally is our composite economic index. Now, this measure can be a little bit more volatile than the UK GDP measure, as you can see from the size of some of the bars here. But I think there are some broad similarities between the performance of the two economies. So you'll see the latter part of 2023, a more subdued economic performance. This particular measure only goes up to the third quarter of last year, but I think if we look at some of the growth that was observed in Q1 and Q3 on this measure, would suggest to us that the Northern Ireland economy probably grew a little bit faster than the wider UK last year. But as we look into 2025 and 2026, we think that there are 5 key factors that are likely to impact the performance of the economy. So I'm going to start with a couple of the factors that might positively impact output levels, and then cover some of the ones that may weigh down on economic growth. So if we start with the policy environment, monetary policy in the UK has now begun to loosen. So the Bank of England have started bringing down interest rates in response to those slightly lower inflation rates compared to previous years. And in February, the Bank of England brought base rate down to 4.5%. They maintained it there in March. But our expectation is that monetary policy will continue to loosen as we go through this year. So with rates of around 4.5%, this I think is still a fairly restrictive monetary policy stance. That's probably appropriate given there's still some inflationary pressures in the economy, but they are lower than we've seen in recent years. And I think that will probably lead the Bank of England to very gradually continue to unwind that restrictive policy position that they've been forced to impose in the last couple of years to combat inflation. So that's a positive. If monetary policy does continue to loosen, it brings the cost of borrowing down and could support spending and investment levels. But we do just need to bear in mind that even if the policy rate does continue to lower, it will probably still be at a rate much higher than households and businesses have been used to in the years following the financial crisis, where we had close to a 15-year period or so where interest rates were very close to zero. Don't think we're going back to that. So even if we do come down to a lower rate than we are now, it's still going to be higher than a lot of people and a lot of businesses have been used to over recent years. We then get to fiscal policy. And so you can probably tell that I wrote these slides before yesterday's spring statement. But if we maybe just take a couple of the events that have happened around fiscal policy over the last 6 months or so. In last autumn, when we had the UK budget, that included a significant rise in government spending, borrowing, and taxation. And so that increase in government spending is likely to provide some support to the economy moving forward. So government spending is one of the 5 factors that make up GDP. It's consumer spending, government spending, investment, we add on exports, and then we take away imports. So if government spending is rising, that gives a boost to overall economic output levels. But as we saw yesterday in the spring statement, the fiscal rules have led to the Chancellor to have to make some tough decisions around welfare reductions, around future spending in government departments in a few years' time to try and get back within those fiscal rules. And the headroom, which she has been able to bring back to what it was in October, is still very small. So that does mean there is the potential for future uncertainty in fiscal policy. So looking into this year and next year, government spending likely to support economic output growth, but the fiscal environment is still one of uncertainty and constrained public finances. That higher taxation we talked about in the budget, including the rise in employers' national insurance contributions due to take effect next month, could impact the economy in a number of ways. The increase in business costs could see firms either raising prices in response to that. They may scale back on pay rises or recruitment, and may also weigh down on their investment levels, all of which could take a toll on economic output. I've mentioned how inflation is closer to its target, but relative to probably the second half of last year and what inflation forecasts were looking like, our expectation, along with others now, is that inflation will run a bit higher than previously thought. And that's a result of higher energy and utility prices. It's a result of that potential increase in prices as businesses respond to increased costs, and also global uncertainties. Which takes us to that last point there about emerging global developments. So we've seen the US administration announce and begin to implement tariffs on goods from specific countries. And geopolitical events are still highly uncertain, including around the war in Ukraine and developments in the Middle East. And this global uncertainty could weigh down on business investment. So taking all those factors together, what we have forecasted in our most recent sector forecast report is growth of around 0.9% in Northern Ireland and in the UK in 2025. That was a downward revision from our previous forecast, which was for growth of about 1.4%. But we are hopeful that the rate of growth will pick up in 2026, hopefully back up to something around 1.4%. We think that inflation is going to average about 3.2% this year, and then hopefully come down to around 2.5% next year. And unemployment, we think in Northern Ireland is still relatively low, but beginning to increase somewhat. In terms of economic growth by sector, there's quite a lot on the slide, so I'm not going to talk to all of this, but I will point to a few groups of sectors in the economy. Our expectation is that the business services sector, so professional, scientific and technical services, ICT, admin and support, are likely to be among the fastest growing sectors in Northern Ireland this year and next. They're typically quite strong performers in the local economy, and we expect that to continue. For some of the consumer-focused sectors, we think there'll be growth as well: wholesale and retail trade, accommodation and food, arts, entertainment and recreation. Wholesale and retail trade a little higher, accommodation and arts entertainment in around the middle of the pack there. Some of the factors supporting that could be higher wage growth in the economy and some resilience in consumer confidence, but we could also see some of those cost pressures impacting those sectors. Manufacturing has faced some challenges in recent years, including skills shortages and global uncertainty. And with the outlook for business investment somewhat subdued, and with manufacturing a relatively investment-oriented sector of the economy, we think growth there could be a bit weaker this year, but hopefully picking up as we move into 2026. But as the Chancellor spoke about yesterday, there are a lot of risks and uncertainty facing the economy, and the world is changing and evolving rapidly. And we've highlighted a few of the key risks that could impact the economy and our forecasts here. So inflation could increase at a faster pace than we thought. As I've mentioned, core and services inflation is still quite elevated. Wage growth in the UK and Northern Ireland economies that's quite high as well. So domestic price pressures are still evident. We've seen over the last few years how changes in geopolitical events can impact energy prices, which is a constant source of inflation uncertainty. And we also know about those increasing business costs that are coming up. So there's a number of factors there that create risks around inflation as we look forward. If inflation were to run at higher rates than we thought, that could weigh down on household purchasing power and on consumer spending. And it could also lead the Bank of England to need to keep interest rates at a higher rate for a longer period of time. Those tax increases on businesses could weigh more heavily than we expect. So there is uncertainty around the extent to which those will prompt business actions. If those actions are more adverse than we thought, that could weigh on the pace of growth. Skill shortages and recruitment challenges continue to be issues impacting the local economy. And along with other challenges such as high rates of economic inactivity, low rates of productivity, there's factors there which are long-standing issues in Northern Ireland which are still relevant as we look at the economic outlook. And global developments could weigh on growth as well. There's a lot of uncertainty around the global trade outlook, including with regards to US tariff announcements, but also how other countries may respond to that. And geopolitical developments are also highly uncertain at the minute as well. So I think in summary, what we're saying here is that we do expect the Northern Ireland economy to grow this year. Perhaps not as quickly as we thought it was going to grow in 2025 when we were making forecasts last autumn, as some factors such as global uncertainty and higher inflation are starting to take a toll. And there's a lot of risks and uncertainties out there. The economic environment continues to evolve almost on a daily basis at the minute, but we're hopeful that we will see some growth this year, and hopefully that will pick up as we move into 2026. So I'm going to stop there. There'll be time for questions, as Gillian has mentioned, as we go through the webinar, and I'm going to hand over to Maureen. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Connor. Gillian, for the introduction, and I have the pleasure. Good afternoon, everyone. I have the pleasure of actually telling you what you think and how you think things are going at the moment. I have undertaken the member survey for, as Gillian says, quite a few years now. So, and it's always a really, really rich survey, both in terms of just the feedback, but the quality of the feedback is really strong as well. And the members always have great ideas about what should be done to make the economy work better here. And this year we had almost 300 responses to the survey. And arguably, to give it a bit of a plug, it would be great if you could, as many of you as possible going forward, could fill it in, because it really is a really critical survey, and it has great traction as well in terms of what ministers, etc., and the feedback that it actually provides to ministers and to the executive. We ask a broad range of questions in the survey, you know, obviously about the kind of your perceptions on the economy, etc., but also about yourselves and your jobs. So it's a really good link in terms of how things are going, both from a wider Northern Ireland economy perspective, but also for the membership, for the sector, for chartered accountants, and in terms of how you actually go about, you know, being in work. So in terms of this year, again, timing is key. The timing of the survey was between kind of January, February, and you know, that really does affect sentiment. And what it was doing was coming after the autumn budget, and you know, a lot of negative sentiment towards what it might do for business, and particularly in terms of things like the national insurance contribution and the employer national insurance contribution rise. So that's, you know, that's an important context. But as I say, we do have longevity in the survey in terms of what it says in the past. But you know, the overall kind of sentiment among members was that economic confidence was low. The Northern Ireland economy is seen as weak, with most believing it's either stagnant or contracting. So just to give you a few figures as you can see from the pie chart, around 40% thought the economy was growing, 42% believes it's stagnant, and 16% contracting. I mean, you know, you could turn that to a positive to say, well, you know, 2 in 5 do think there's growth, you know, but you know, again, arguably around 60% think that the economy is either not performing at all or actually contracting. And again, just a bit of context, in 2018-19, about 60% of members, so pre-COVID, around 60% of members thought, and a EU exit, thought the Northern Ireland economy was growing. Financial distress, it's still high. About 16% of members think financial distress is increasing, but that's down from about 77% in 2022. So there's that sense that, yes, there's financial distress out there, but it's not just as bad. And, you know, as Connor alluded to, you know, the most significant issues that members talk about are the increase in the tax burden and the cutbacks in government spending. They're significant concerns. And then, as we know, kind of post COVID, you know, we've had this issue around the increased cost of doing business, really high inflation and energy costs, although they have obviously been easing, but that squeeze on living standards as well. So they're the kind of top issues. But other issues which we'll allude to is the labour market issue, the kind of public sector dependence, political dysfunction, infrastructure deficit. So lots of different issues. I mean, and that's what, you know, I know generally in the things I look at, there are so many things as context to why things are the way they are. You know, when you think of where we've been in the last few years, you know, having something like the pandemic and trying to get through that, UK EU exit, again, you know, came in at a time, and it's really hard to disentangle what's happening at the moment. And now those geopolitical events, again, you potentially massive implications for the economy. What we also have feedback from members just is that Brexit remains that divisive issue. There is a general view. We've asked questions on EU exit for obviously since the beginning. The general view is that it has harmed the economy, and there's a general consensus from members on that. There's a perception that there's been political failure and missed opportunity, which is something again that's often talked about the benefits of the position that Northern Ireland's in, but there is a feeling of missed opportunity. And then there's a varied business impact. And I know from research I'm doing both, I did some research with DFE just as businesses left the UK, left the EU, but also in the Windsor framework, that variable business impact. Speaking to a business, a very large, one of Northern Ireland's largest manufacturers yesterday, their actually trade's going really well. Dual market access is working, so again, they have the resources to deal with a lot of the issues. The smallest businesses don't have those resources, and you can see that filtering through. And even on the Windsor framework actually wasn't once viewed as one of the more positive aspects for members. Now, it was around 1 in 5 thought the Windsor framework was a positive, but at the same time, in terms of trying to find something positive about what's happening at the moment, it was one of the top issues. The other kind of concern there would be that confidence around Northern Ireland's economic prospects have halved in 2025. So we had about 17% of members thought prospects were good or better last year when we asked that question. It's down to 18% or 8% rather this year. Again, I think timing is key because interestingly, Conor alluded to the Northern Ireland Composite Index. It's just out this morning, and actually it shows that Northern Ireland the annual growth in the composite index, again, just one measure of growth. It's not directly comparable to the UK in many respects, but it grew by 3.6% over the year compared to 1.4% for the UK as a whole. And interestingly, again, Northern Ireland's trade statistics have been better. So you can actually see, there's arguably those benefits, dual market access starting to come through in the trade statistics as well. So if we look to the next slide, this one, I say, if I could hand everyone out the open-ended parts to this, I think you'd find them all very interesting. But we asked a number of questions. We asked a lot of detail last year on basically how the executive, and how the government was performing in Northern Ireland. And it was very strong views from members, and that's followed through into this year's survey. I think the expression I picked up was one of pragmatic frustration, which I thought was quite a good way of putting it. But generally confidence in government is low, but there is that feeling that something else is needed. Greater tax autonomy is needed. It's a strong statement, but the general perception is the executive's not trusted to manage public finances effectively. But as I said, that's something that has been persistent in terms of members' views over the last couple of years. The UK government had launched an industrial strategy last year, and we asked specifically about that. Again, there's lots of strategies in play, but there's general skepticism about, what it can actually achieve. And again, interestingly, a strong statement was made by the Northern Ireland Office and Treasury around the autumn budget that it was a budget to fix the foundations and deliver change for Northern Ireland. And 2/3 of members don't actually believe that that is the case. And again, some very strong comments there, even to the point of saying that throwing money at the problem won't fix it. And lots of ideas around what could be done, which we'd arguably talk about later. We have asked about corporation tax for quite a few, really from the outset again. And again, the members were very strongly supportive of corporation tax devolution. And obviously that's something we've got in legislation and nothing's happened with, and that's a very much a watching brief in terms of how that might run out. But there is strong support for tax reform, and you still have that majority of members, around 3 and 5, would support the devolved corporation tax powers. And again, it came through quite clearly in the survey as well this year. Around 2/3 want that tax alignment with the Republic of Ireland to attract investment. And just an overall sense from the members in terms of what's needed. And it's interesting in relation to the relatively recent launch of the programme for government in Northern Ireland. The members emphasise the need for what they call a clear costed transformation plan. The UK government has made a commitment to transformation. There's been small amounts of money given to the devolved nations for that, and some of that money's starting to work its way through government, but they're very small amounts. And when you think of the kinds of challenges that are here, obviously the health service being a very strong case in point, but infrastructure again, particularly lots of challenge, education reform, how you actually finance some sort of transformation plan, I think is a real challenge. Then if we move on to the next slide, this is something, again, I find this one a really interesting one, because from a member's perspective, you have a very highly educated membership, chartered accountants. They've infiltrated every aspect of the economy, which I think is again critical. Public, private, third sector, you'll find chartered accountants across all of them. So I think the perceptions, around this are really, really important, because they're seeing it from every angle. And what you can see there is just something that I know I've seen really crank up in the last few years in terms of lots of the surveys I work on with the Northern Ireland Chamber, the All Ireland Business Monitor, Enterprise Northern Ireland's Business Barometer. Those skill shortages, really starting to become acute. That struggle to recruit talent is key. Views that skills shortage is obviously a major problem. 56% of members say their businesses are struggling to recruit the right people. And many believe that Northern Ireland's education system does not adequately prepare young people for the workforce. And one thing that really struck me was with the Intertrade's All Ireland Business Monitor, attitude of workers as well is seen as a really difficult piece to manage now for employers as well. Training investment, again, despite the challenges, I haven't seen anything really with a big, strong kick up in terms of trying to invest in training. The members believe that's lacking, and actually only 40% of members feel well supported in career training. There is strong job security amongst members, which is great to hear and to see, but that career progression piece actually is something that members believe is more challenging, and there are diversity concerns as well, which is something that we'll arguably delve into a bit more down the road with the member survey. Again, something that's very much on the radar, and obviously something that's been specifically looked at in the programme for government, is the whole concept of childcare. But again, we're talking about members who, are on probably average earnings, above the median in terms of Northern Ireland, and there's still that view that childcare is expensive. Only 14% believe it's affordable. Hard to find, so it's not just the cost, it's actually finding it. And you have many parents relying on family for childcare, or to adjust their working hours to manage responsibilities. And when you've got a tight labour market and you're trying to get people for jobs, I think this is it's a really important consideration, and again, obviously something the executive is looking at. And I thought, interestingly, obviously massive move towards hybrid working during COVID, and there's quite a significant investment in trying to keep that in place. But what we have seen in this survey is that around 1 in 4 employers are trying to bring people back into work. And that's something that we have started to see probably in the last 6 to 8 months. You can see that more and more, that kind of general trend towards saying we need people back in work. So probably just like to conclude this piece. There's lots more in the survey, which will probably make its way out into the public domain shortly. But what we do have is, I think, concerns that, I would have concerns about the labour market going forward. By 2031, I think it's a really striking statistic. There's going to be more deaths than births in Northern Ireland, and that's already happening in Scotland. So the implications, for what's happening in the labour market, along even with very significant issues like special educational needs and the kind of growth in that, what the labour market is going to look like going forward is really challenging. So I'll hand over to Gareth now, and I think he's going to talk about skills as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, and good afternoon, everyone.
So maybe while we're waiting for Gareth to get back online, Conor, do you want to just pop onto the screen there a moment? And there's a couple of questions here. certainly one of which I can probably cover off fairly quickly. What are the main drivers for the service inflation being greater than manufacturing?
So I think one of the things here is probably related to wage pressures in the economy. So as we talked about, manufacturing can be much more prone to the likes of energy price increases. And so relative to a few years ago, while energy prices are still elevated, they're not as high as they were. So goods inflation is a bit lower. Services inflation is impact. Look, energy still has an impact. Even if you're in a services business, you still have to heat your building, etc. So costs still flow through there. But it's quite often more closely linked to wage inflation, and wage rises in the economy are pretty high at the minute. So I think that's probably one of the factors there, and they're not getting the offsetting changes in energy price inflation that manufacturing, which is more goods focused, could be.
Okay, thank you. Gareth, I can see you're back and you're moving. We'll maybe try again.
Yeah, we'll give it a go again.
In there, Connor. Thank you.
So thank you, Connor, for stepping into the breach. Very much appreciated. So yeah, just to echo actually one of the points that Maureen had made in her presentation was the importance of the Chartered Accountants members survey, because obviously as an economist, I look at a lot of data, and whenever we get other business umbrella organizations providing their survey returns, what you're getting is people telling you what's going on in their specific business, and that's obviously very important. But as accountants, what you're all able to do is not just tell us what's going on in your business, but tell us what's going on in lots of businesses. So there's a much broader perspective that you're able to bring. So in terms of moving that on, that's obviously, and getting that insight, that's invaluable to us. So in terms of what I'm going to look at, that's my bit for Maureen. So Maureen, you can buy me a pint later. In terms of what I'm going to look at, I'm going to focus a little bit on the labour market, and then some of the challenges that businesses are facing, and indeed the Chancellor needs to address. So we'll focus on the labour market in the first instance, and in particular this chart here on the left looks at payrolled employees. And what we can see, the chart goes back to 2015, very strong growth in payrolled employees over the last 10 years, and very quickly after the pandemic we returned to our previous trend line. However, we can see for, I suppose, much of the last year that has started to plateau, albeit a bit of an increase in the last couple of months. So this is kind of the first indication of the slowdown in the economy that Connor talked about, the first sort of signs that was starting to happen. Obviously, and it's been mentioned as well about the national insurance contributions and what that's likely to do to employment. So this is something that we'll be paying particularly close attention to. Nevertheless, the increase that we've seen from early 2020, so pre-pandemic in Northern Ireland, is the highest increase across all 12 UK regions. Not very often that Northern Ireland tops these types of charts, but this is one. But we can see across all 12 regions, there has been growth in payrolled employees since early 2020. That's the employee story. The self-employed story then is slightly different. This chart goes back to 1995. I'll deal with a historic component in a minute. But what we can see more recently is after the pandemic, we saw a very significant reduction in the number of self-employed. And it's really only in the last year that we've seen something pertaining to, I guess, a sustainable return to growth in self-employment. But we are still well below where we were in early 2020. And that reduction in self-employed in Northern Ireland is the largest percentage reduction across all 12 UK regions. So Northern Ireland at the extreme in both measures. But you can see even across most regions of the UK, there's still a lower level of self-employed compared to what we saw in early 2020. Going back, sort of looking at it from a more historical point of view, we can see that over the last 30 years, there's only been a very marginal increase in the total self-employed in Northern Ireland. It was just over 100,000 back in 1995. It's about 110, 112,000 now. And to put that in some sort of context, back in 1995, total employment in the economy was around 630,000, and it's now in the region of 880 to 890,000. So very significant increase in employment, but almost all of that has come through employee growth rather than self-employment growth. And these two different colours then, this is the gender breakdown. And we can see the darker blue line, this is male self-employment. Self-employment is still predominantly a male employment status. But again, we could see going back over 30 years, there's actually fewer males self-employed now than there were in 1995. This is about 17,000 females. That has increased to about 27,000. So the increase again, and this is reflected in the employment market overall, the increase in the self-employment is very much driven by increased female participation in the labour market. The claimant count then, very briefly, we could see pre-pandemic, it stabilised, was very stable at around 30,000. Post-pandemic, the recovery then was higher, or it stabilised at a higher level, around 35,000. But in more recent months, or for much of the last year, the claimant count has increased again, sort of mirroring that taper that we saw in the employee numbers. And as I said, obviously with the national insurance contributions, we'll see what continues to happen on the claimant count. And then the final part of the labour market analysis then is the economically inactive. And this is split into four groups primarily. We have those who are sick, those looking after the family in the home, those who have retired. It's important to point out that we talk about the retired who are economically inactive. We're still talking about the working age population. So these are people below the age of 65, and their occupational pension, for example, allows them to have retired early. And then we can see student seen as generally accepted as a positive economic inactivity, and this has been increasing typically year on year for a long time. And yeah, that it's a good thing. Young people staying in education longer and increasing their skills. In terms of the retired, then that's actually lower now. I should point out these bars. So the grey bars that's Q4 2024. So that's the latest data. This is a year ago or a year previous, Q4 2023. And then this dark blue then is our pre-pandemic baseline. Now, there was a narrative, and certainly whenever the pandemic hit, that a lot of people retired early. The numbers jumped up initially, not by a huge amount, but they did increase, but they very quickly came back to pre-pandemic levels, and you can see we're actually marginally lower. This is an interesting one here. Those looking after the family or home with caring responsibilities, this has fallen quite a bit. And is part of a long-term trend. I mean, if we were to go back sort of 15, 20 years, then the numbers with caring responsibilities would have been well over 80,000. And again, this mirrors what we're seeing in the employee market, and labour market in particular, with increased female participation. That they're coming out of this economic inactivity group. But the big problem that Northern Ireland faces then is people who are long-term sick. And we can see that has been increasing recently, but also in the long term. And the chart over here on the right, so this is, we can see Northern Ireland has the highest proportion of people economically inactive due to sickness across all 12 UK regions. I would argue that dealing with economic inactivity is probably one of the most important challenges that government faces. and indeed a lot of my conversations in DFE and DFC and with other areas of government is around tackling this economic inactivity problem, which is a tough nut to crack. Okay, so hot on the heels then of the spring statement, some of the challenges then that need to be addressed. Maureen touched on this, actually, was demographics. We did some work last year for the Strategic Investment Board looking at the change in Northern Ireland's demographics. This analysis goes out to 2050, and what we can see over this period, significant reduction of the children and young people, 61,000, or a drop of 13%. Of then the working age, I've split this into two groups, so the 19 to 40-year-olds and the 41 to 65-year-olds. You can see that that's going to broadly plateau over the next 25 years. But you can also see that the average age of the working age cohort will increase. Now, that's less of an issue for some sectors like professional services, but clearly for other sectors such as construction, people are not going to continue to work into their 60s and even beyond. So this may not look like too much of an issue, but actually it will be for some sectors more than others. And then I suppose the real challenge for government is this, the older age population increasing very significantly. Obviously, it creates fiscal challenges in terms of more people in receipt of pension payments, but also this is the age group that puts most pressure on health and social care sector. And what I would say, I suppose that the point that I make, although the analysis goes out to 2050, what we found when we look at the data, in more detail, is that these changes in demographics, so this reduction in the number of younger people and this increase in the number of older people, the most of that change happens by 2040, and that obviously brings forward significantly the timeline for which policy decisions have to be taken, both in terms of what does the future education estate look like, and then also in terms of what infrastructure needs to be put in place to support an older age population. And another big issue that government needs to address is investment. This chart here looks a bit busy, but this looks at gross fixed capital formation, which is basically an investment. And what I have here is the GFCF for the G7 countries, and I've included Ireland across various years, 2000, 5, 10, 15, 20, and then 21 and 22. And what we can see, this is the UK here on the left of each of these, of them circled in red. The UK is typically the lowest levels of investment as a percent of GDP across its G7 peers. I think there was one year, in 2015, Italy pipped us to the post, but in general we've got lower levels of capital investment. The big outlier here is Ireland in 2020, and this light blue element, so this is business investment. I haven't looked at this data in huge detail, but I strongly suspect that was very much driven by business investment in the pharmaceutical sector during the pandemic, because we can see that the following year in 2021, Ireland was back to sort of G7 average levels. So that's basically the UK poor performer against its international peers. The chart on the right then looks at investment across the 4 UK nations, and this blue line at the bottom here towards the end, so this is Northern Ireland, and what we can see is prior to the financial crisis, we were in the pack in terms of levels of investment. We peaked in 2008. That would have been driven by residential development, but then in the subsequent years that fell, and we've never really recovered. And so, yeah, the UK is a poor performer internationally, and we're a poor performer in a UK setting. So that is something that requires significant attention from government. And then I'm going to finish off with a bit of economic theory, which I think certainly the Chancellor and people in the Treasury would do well to remind themselves of. This is called the Laffer curve. This was developed by an American economist called Arthur Laffer, and his theory was, in essence, if we assume that this chart, this is income tax. If you set income tax at 0%, you set the rate at 0%, then you're going to raise zero tax revenue. If you set the income tax rate at 100%, you will also raise zero tax revenue, because why would you work if all your money's going to government? And so there is therefore the essence of what Laffer was saying was, you can't continue to increase the tax rate and continue to expect an increase in tax revenue. And there's somewhere a level, and obviously we don't know where it is at any particular tax rate, but there is a rate at which you maximize the return. And so, yeah, higher tax rates doesn't always mean higher revenues. And two examples that were talked about, particularly last year around non-doms, people were talking about increasing the tax rate on non-doms. Two things to be aware of non-doms: one, they're wealthy, but two, they're mobile. And so if you go after them from a tax perspective, then they have the ability to leave and move to other countries with more amenable tax regimes. In addition to that, we have North Sea oil and gas. This is even prior to Ed Miliband, his refusal to sign off on new exploration leases in the North Sea. Tax rates in North Sea were so high that many energy businesses were not investing in projects there because they could seek higher returns elsewhere. And so the basic principle whenever you're setting tax is that people and investment projects are mobile. And one example, just to give you where the Laffer curve occurred in the UK, some of you remember in 2013, the top rate of income tax, Judge Osborne reduced that from 50% to 45%. Now that group, the top rate of income taxpayers, raised around £90 billion of revenue. What the Inland Revenue found was that when they reduced the tax rate from 50 to 45%, the revenue raised did not fall. And the then chair of the OBR, Sir Robert Choate, was quoted at the time as saying, "Britain is strolling across the summit of the Laffer curve." So we were somewhere up here, and we were able to move to somewhere just to the left of the red dot, reduce the tax rate without a negative impact on earnings. And whilst a lot of people are talking about wanting to increase taxes on higher people, one final point just that the IFS made, the Institute for Fiscal Studies made last year, the top 1% of earners in the UK pay 29% of all the income tax that was paid, and that's increased from 21% in 2000. So we do have quite a progressive tax regime. But this group here, as I said, they're highly skilled, they're highly mobile, and if you tax them too highly, then the opportunities, the international opportunities for this group will become more appealing, and they're likely to leave. So I'm just going to stop here, and obviously happy to take questions and hand you back to Gillian.
Thanks, Gareth. Connor and Maureen, do you want to come back on camera there? So we'll kick off with some questions. I think there's a couple of fairly challenging ones in there, but Connor, one for yourself. What can you tell us about consumer confidence in Northern Ireland?
Thanks, Gillian. At Danske Bank, we publish a consumer confidence index each quarter, where we work with a survey company to survey about 1,000 people locally. And we ask them about how they feel around their current finances, their future finances, their job security, and the amount they expect to spend on expensive items. Our most recent survey was for the final quarter of 2024. And what that showed us at the time was that consumer confidence in Northern Ireland increased. So it increased over the quarter, and it increased compared to the final quarter of 2023 as well. And actually, we started that survey back in 2008. So the overall confidence level at the end of last year was about 9% higher than the long-term average. So actually a reasonable degree of confidence in the local economy. And at those sub-levels, what people told us is compared to Q3 of last year, in the final quarter, they felt more confident about their current finances. They were feeling better about how they thought their finances would change in the next 12 months and in the amount that they expected to spend on expensive items. Perhaps interestingly, they felt a little bit less confident about job security. And within our consumer confidence index, what we tend to see is that the job security component of it is relatively more stable than the other three. So it doesn't tend to move as much, but a slight decline in confidence around job security at the end of last year. In terms of the factors that were impacting confidence, so people told us that the restoration of the executive had a positive impact on confidence levels. So the fact that it happened just slightly over a year ago now, but the fact that we have our politicians back and making policy decisions for Northern Ireland has had a positive impact on sentiment among consumers. And lower inflation also boosted confidence, but the inflation one is an interesting one. So while people told us that lower inflation made them feel more confident, they also said that the impact of higher prices on household budgets had the largest negative impact on sentiment levels. So I think what that is telling us is that the fact that inflation is lower than what it was in 2022 and 2023 is a positive. It's better for consumers if inflation is closer to that 2% target than the 7, 8, 9, 10s that we saw previously. But what's important here is that the cumulative impact of those price rises over a number of years are still taking a toll on people here. So we need to remember, as much as inflation has come down, that doesn't mean that prices are falling. It just means that prices are rising at a slower rate. So the fact that we had a number of years of very high inflation rates, the cumulative impact of that all built up is still the factor which is having the most negative impact on people's sentiment levels in the local economy. So, but overall, we saw a bit of a boost in Q4 last year. That's obviously supportive of the likes of our consumer and retail sectors in Northern Ireland. And is one of the factors that I talked about when looking at why we think we'll see some growth in those areas of the economy this year.
Okay, thanks, Cara. Maureen, one for you. Obviously, there was a fair amount of negative feedback on the member survey, but what do the members see as the key economic opportunities for Northern Ireland?
Thanks, Gillian. Yes, and I suppose economists are known to be pessimistic and always tell you the bad things, but there's a lot of constructive comment as well there among members. I mean, it's interesting because that I actually, whenever I was looking at the findings, I tried to focus on positives and negatives, but in terms of the opportunities, the dual market access piece, I think, is very much to the fore. I know that there's been a struggle to kind of quantify what that has meant, but I think that's because for a lot of businesses, it's been business as usual. So, whenever that's the case, then it's very hard to say, well, this is the difference that it's made. But that uniqueness in dual market access is believed to be an advantage, but one that's been underutilized. And the potential for that in terms of trade, is significant. A thing that came through strongly as well, which kind of links in with that, is that closer integration with the Irish economy and the potential to bring more investment there. And you're even thinking around how that all-island economy works is important. And having just recently done a big piece of work on cross-border workers, just making sure that integration works, because it can benefit both jurisdictions. And that links in with foreign direct investment. It's still a feeling that there's a lot of potential with foreign and direct investment for Northern Ireland as well, and particularly in terms of key sectors. So members see opportunities with technology and innovation, manufacturing and engineering, the green economy, financial services. So there's lots of positive in terms of there's cores of sectors there that are are doing well and have great potential. Tourism and hospitality. The golfers out there mentioned the Open and the Ryder Cup, so that's to the fore. But again, you know, there's a very tangible tourism base there to work on, and you know, in spite of the challenges in the labour market, it's still a well-educated workforce, and there's strong universities as well. So those are the kinds of opportunities in terms of how you sell Northern Ireland, and how to support growth. You know, the context being just the fact that there are, you know, significant improvements needed in terms of governance, planning, you know, infrastructure, all of the things that really are needed to support that to happen.
Oh, thanks, Maureen. Gareth, the national insurance contribution increases. What are businesses saying about the likely impact, and how are they likely to respond?
Yeah, we've completed some research, or in the process of completing some research on both the national living wage increases and the national insurance contribution changes for the Department of Finance, and as part of that research, we went out and spoke to quite a few businesses, quite an extensive consultation exercise undertaken. And what I would say is, the national living wage increase first, that was expected. Now, it went up more than perhaps businesses wanted, but the national living wage always went up more than businesses expected. So there was a degree of anticipation there. But the national insurance contribution changes came completely as a surprise, and therefore that was much more difficult to manage. Now, I think what the government was thinking at the time, and what it wanted to see, was an increase in investment to raise productivity. So you would have, as the cost of labour increases, then that should orientate investment towards capital, and as I say, raise productivity. And at the time, and Maureen also mentioned it, still, you know, a lot of the primary issues that businesses are currently facing are finding staff with the right skills to fill vacancies. So I think the government probably took the call that it was a relatively low risk measure to take, although that certainly isn't how it's played out. Another important point is the reduction in the threshold at which the national insurance contributions becomes payable. That has had the greatest impact on the cost of employing lower paid workers, and particularly part-time workers. So there's a distributional impact there, and so sectors that have a high proportion of low paid workers are going to be more impacted. In terms of how businesses are responding, it's not the way that the government would want, and it's not necessarily positive for economic growth. Certainly, a lot of businesses, some of the increase or additional costs will feed through in terms of higher prices. Now that obviously has upward pressure on inflation, and will mean that interest rates are likely to stay higher for longer. Businesses are also talking about reducing pay and benefits for other higher paid staff, and the narrowing of the differentials between grades. We don't expect to see any significant layoffs, but what I think firms have certainly indicated is they've reduced their recruitment intentions, and so that's particularly, I say, in lower paid sectors. And far from increasing investment, their firms are likely to reduce investment because more money has been taken out of the business to pay for national insurance contribution. One other point, now this is not across the board, but there is an increased risk of many businesses returning to a cash in hand basis, where both accepting cash from customers and also in terms of paying their staff. Now that obviously will result in lower tax revenues for government. And the one final point that's important to make, that Gillian, is obviously we focus very much on the private sector, but the voluntary and community sector, and I'm speaking as someone who's a trustee of a charity, the voluntary and community sector is that delivers a lot of public services, services are also very significantly impacted. So if you're delivering adult social care, a lot of people in that sector are paid at or near the national living wage. That's the group that's most impacted. They will not receive the additional funding that goes to public sector services. And they're in a really tricky position where government, in many respects, controls their costs in terms of national living wage, national insurance contributions, but government also controls the price that they can charge for their services through contracts, and also where we have some businesses, let's say, for example, in the hospitality sector, that can close for 2 or 3 quiet days of the week. If you're providing essential public services to people with special needs, that's a service you need to provide seven days a week. So the voluntary and community sector, I think, has been sorely overlooked by the Chancellor and the Treasury more generally, and I don't see an easy way out of it without making significant additional funding available.
Okay, thanks. So a related question just on that. Do you believe the prior decision to increase employers' national insurance is now counterintuitive to a reduction in welfare spending and trying to encourage people back into work?
Yeah, because I suppose it goes to my Laffer curve point, which is when you increase tax rates at some point, if that has a negative impact on the economy, your tax take falls. Um, and also when we look at the jobs that are most impacted, it's lower paid jobs. That tends to be either younger people just entering the labour market or other people with lower level skills. And if employers become less inclined to recruit younger people or less inclined to bring people with lower skills back into the labour market, then it will result in an increase in welfare payments. So yeah, it's certainly a good point that was made.
Yeah. I don't know who wants to try this one. The question is, do you anticipate future budgets will roll back on current enhanced capital allowances provision? Any takers for that one?
Well, given mine is the only mic that's not muted, then I better start talking. I think that, okay, so first of all, that would be a measure that I would support the maintenance of enhanced capital allowances because, and again, to go to one of the points, the UK and Northern Ireland's low levels of investment need to be encouraged and supported. Given the state of the public finances, I find it difficult to believe that the government is going to look at tax breaks. They're trying to find areas where they're going to raise more revenue rather than reduce tax rates and give money back to businesses, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Now, there's a couple of comments in. There's a question and there's also a comment in the chat, both relating to corporation tax devolution, and the question says, what would be the point in granting NI increased powers in relation to tax raising if the executive cannot be trusted to manage finances? And the comment in the chat talks about it being a moot point if Trump is pulling the US investment out of Ireland. I suppose the comment I would make would be that those were the views expressed in the member survey, not necessarily the views of the panel. But Maureen, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, the corporation tax one. Yeah, the members are. I said we've asked that for a number of years, and the view is there's a compelling argument in the corporation tax alignment with Ireland, but there are concerns around. At the end of the day, that'll impact on the block grant to Northern Ireland. So you need to be very sure of what the policy was going to achieve before you did it. And I think that's obviously a big issue around why it hasn't happened. But the Northern Ireland Executive also have to demonstrate that their ability to actually take that on. And the issue there is they're probably a long way off going there. I mean, Scotland obviously did it with income tax, and that's had mixed results. So the corporation tax debate never seems to, to have any momentum. So, you'd imagine, unless something happens quickly in the next couple of years, and that's unlikely, particularly in the context of, again, what steps can Northern Ireland take to demonstrate it can devolve more tax powers, and we haven't demonstrated that kind of fiscal responsibility yet to go there. If you think of how tight the budget is now, that we have a range of super parity measures where we don't implement the same regime as the rest of the UK, water charges being a case in point, and we won't go there either in terms of thinking how we actually start to raise revenue. So I think the sentiment might be there in corporation tax, but the delivery I think is a whole different ballgame.
The one point just I would make on, so I agree with everything that Maureen said there. Quite often when I'm talking to people, there is a concern that if there are further tax powers devolved to Northern Ireland, that the executive would increase tax. So, for example, if income tax was to be devolved to Northern Ireland, the executive would increase it. And I sometimes think, well, on what basis are you coming to that judgment? Because our executive never increase any taxes or charges. Maureen just gave the example there of water charges. So, if we were to have devolved taxes, one, I think there is this huge reluctance to increase the tax rate, and obviously if we reduce the tax rate, that comes out of the block grant in some shape or form, and we just simply do not have the resources in the public finances locally to be able to absorb any lower taxes. So I think it would be, if we did have the powers devolved, we would be getting them devolved to use them at some point in the medium to long term, not in the short term.
Okay, thank you. And look, we'll build on that. Maureen, what ideas did members put forward in the survey for raising additional revenue or for saving money?
It's interesting because, again, you can tell how informed members are. I think that's always very striking to me as well. You have a very informed debate there. But in terms of raising revenue, the way it did focus on the super parity measures, and water charges came up there as top in terms of arguably necessary to fund infrastructure. And obviously to sustain water management. And we know the fallout from that at the minute is very tangible in terms of, what the impact it's having on house building, for example, and just general expansion. I mean, I've been told businesses can't expand at the moment because, of the water and wastewater infrastructure issues. When you start to get to that point, it's a very serious point in terms of where you go to next in terms of trying to expand the economy. Prescription fees is something, again, we have. It's probably it's less. There's very little money really in that. Property taxes is an interesting one in terms of the business rates that we all already pay. Road tolls. I mean, I don't know about any of you, but I was where was I? Drove to Limerick, I think, and I was up and down toll roads the whole way. So it'll be interesting in terms of what that could raise. It's still something, and again, it demonstrates that willingness to do something. But a lot of the comments really were around public sector cuts and efficiencies, that it's not about raising money. If you actually thought about doing things better and more focused, then you'd have savings to make, and that, would obviously have an impact. And, Rachel Reeves has gone there in terms of, I think she's talking about 15% public sector cuts. They'll arguably make their way into Northern Ireland in some shape or form. So, there's already that momentum behind thinking, how do we do things differently?
Okay. Thanks, Maureen. Gareth, there's a number of questions here for you. So we'll start with the question is it possible there's a correlation between an increase in sick category and a decrease in family home category? And is there any further drill down available in the other category? Hopefully you know exactly what that's referencing. Off the top of my head, I can't remember which slide it was.
No, I think, yeah, they're referring to the economically inactive. So in terms of correlation between sick and those with caring responsibilities or looking after the family and home, I don't think that's the case. I mean, that the reduction in those with caring responsibilities is reflected in a higher number of people who are economically inactive due to sickness. when you look at the data, though, that group, that caring group, is predominantly female. It has been falling for a long period of time. When you look at the labour market, the increase in the labour market has come predominantly from female participation. It's a natural transition that we see. The people moving on to sickness don't necessarily follow the same profile of the people who were who had caring responsibilities. But in terms of the other category, it's not a great name, but the other name that we have for them is discouraged. So these are people who do not necessarily identify within each of the four main categories, but they are discouraged from either personally or through circumstances, whatever, from re-engaging in the labour market. That group is quite volatile because it's self-identified, and quite often people, from a benefits perspective, if they can identify health-related benefits that they move into from an economic inactivity point of view, then they'll move into that group, rather than just being simply this discouraged group that we really need to work hard on to get them to move back into the labour market.
Excuse me. So the next question overlaps with that a bit. The observation that, the economic inactivity other almost doubled, 23 to 24. The rest are relatively stable. What does this include? I think you've touched on that. And then the next part of the question is that an anomaly or an emerging trend?
Yeah, so that, as I say, that number's quite volatile. So, and it's because there's maybe not as tight a definition as you have for the other four categories, and a lot of this depends. So it's taken from the labour force survey, and people conducting the labour force survey will want to try to identify as many people as possible in one of the four main categories. So. I wouldn't read too. I mean, and it's the smallest group out of the four. So I wouldn't read too much into significant percentage increases or decreases from one quarter to the next, or from one year to the next in that group.
Okay, and staying on that topic, could Gareth explain the reasons for NI having the greatest levels of economic inactivity through long-term sick, and the fact that despite being the leader in this measure, this is continuing to increase, and what steps are being taken to understand and reverse this by the government?
So whenever I started out as an economist, which was some time ago, I can tell you, Northern Ireland had the highest levels of economic inactivity due to sickness. And this was back in the sort of the mid-90s. And the reason given at the time was the Troubles. And that seemed intuitively correct. And then you sort of fast forward 10 or 15 years, and Northern Ireland, sort of 2005, 2010, Northern Ireland still had the highest levels of economic inactivity. And that was attributed to the legacy of the Troubles. And you went, well, okay, that seems okay. And now here we are, 30 years, 25 years after, the Good Friday Agreement. And Northern Ireland has the highest levels of economic inactivity due to sickness. So I'm going to hazard a guess that there's something else going on. But it's a very fair question. And I think where it is, whenever you look at it geographically, you have very high levels of economic inactivity in certain highly deprived pockets across Northern Ireland, primarily in our larger urban areas, so Belfast and Derry and Strabane. And one of the things that sort of points to is local cultural norms, where you have people growing up in multiple generational households where no one has ever worked. And there tends to be also lower levels of educational attainment, which means that particularly in the more modern economy, it's going to be much harder for those people to find employment. So what are government doing about it? One of the big things that we have is, so not all, but quite a few people who are economically inactive are also on benefits. And whenever those people, so in a previous role, I used to be chair of CERC, the Southeastern Regional College, and we would have lots of instances where this economically inactive group would come to the college and want to raise their skills, want to go on a course for whatever, 6, 8, 10 weeks, whatever it is, to raise their skills so they can start to move into employment. And the first thing that they're told is that they have to come off benefits. And what they do is they reverse straight back out. So and not only that, not only do they decide that that's not a route that they want to pursue, they then obviously are talking to, their friends and neighbours. And then this become, if you are in receipt of benefits, everything is provided for. Why would you want to start to risk that to go on a training program to raise your skills? Because what happens if the training program doesn't work out or you don't move into employment? So one of the things that we were calling on government to do when we were at CERC was to allow more flexibility in terms of people being able to upskill and train themselves, whilst at the same time maintaining their benefits. And another big thing, particularly for people who are sick, is the fear of the benefit reassessment. So if you want to take the chance and move into employment, and for whatever reason it doesn't work out, you've lost your benefits, you then have to go through what is quite a rigorous reassessment process. Now, you could argue that a lot of that is justified in terms of the systems and processes that government have in place, but we also have to accept that that's a huge disincentive for people to move back into employment again. So I think there's starting to be discussions around specific programs. Belfast City Council, for example, run one where employers with education institutions are starting to encourage people who are economically inactive and on benefits into employment. But those are pilot projects that are going on, and I think more. They work well, but I think they need to be rolled out on a much larger basis.
Gillian, if I could just come in there as well. A colleague actually of mine, Anne Devlin from ASRI, has done quite a big piece of work on inactivity in Northern Ireland, but what always strikes me, and I do think the Chancellor is trying to get to it, is the fact that there's perverse incentives in the welfare system, that encourage people to basically stay out of work. So any government intervention is actually supposed to address a market failure. It's not actually supposed to create one. But the welfare system has actually created market failure because it is easier to stay out of work than in work for some people. And I think the unfortunate thing with the way the Chancellor's kind of addressed it is not, just basically not doing their homework better and not having a better case to put to say, look, if we make these improvements, this is the benefits that it will bring.
Yeah. We would have said before that many people on benefits are making the rational choice. What they're doing is rational for them. And until you change that system, then you're going to continue to see the same outcomes.
Okay.
I think
Gareth,
another
okay.
thing that's
Sorry,
another
go
thing that's interesting in this point is, and Gareth showed in some of his labour market charts how things have evolved up to and then following the pandemic. And in terms of structural factors which may have supported people who are economically inactive to engage in the labour force again, is some of the changes in the ways of work that happened post-pandemic. So more working from home, more flexibility. And that doesn't really seem to have happened. So it may have been that there was an opportunity there as the workforce and the labour force began to go through some structural changes to tackle this problem. And respond to some of those changes in the wider economy. And it doesn't seem as if that has been the case. You wonder, was there an opportunity lost there to try and leverage some of that at that point in time?
Thanks, Conor. Good question. Stimulated a lot of discussion. I'll give Gareth a break. Just I've got a couple more for you, so don't go away. But Maureen, can I just ask you, what are the concerns in terms of the longer term challenges for the NI economy?
Oh, how do you put the long list as such? I suppose one of the things we haven't addressed today is productivity. So obviously, it's just that persistent issue of Northern Ireland's low relative productivity. It's been heavily researched, I don't know if anybody's noticed that, but no one seems to have come up with a solution yet, or at least it's talked about a lot and researched a lot. I mean, from what I can see, if you put it in simple terms, it's needing a bigger private sector with more and better businesses, and that's difficult. It's difficult in the context of how much the public sector takes up of the economy here, and it's difficult for companies to scale up and to become large here unless there's some kind of a step change in the kind of maybe fiscal policy or whatever levers that we typically don't have as a region, as opposed to Ireland, which has its own fiscal levers, to go and try things and see what works. So, I think that the productivity piece, still hasn't been addressed. Another issue, we've talked about it, Gareth talked about the aging population, just the fact that that strain on public services going forward is arguably going to be very acute. And again, when you think of the strain on what we already receive from the UK government, how little we earn ourselves. Just as context, this year our budget's going to be around 17 billion. We raise less than 1 billion in that in business rates. That dependency and how you actually start to think about how you support yourselves in we support ourselves in an economy. If in terms of that growth. The kind of post-Brexit adjustments, a concern for me would be, there's a bill called the EU Retained Law Bill, which the UK has, and it's starting to move, away from EU regulations and law and legislation. And the movement of that, I think, would be a big concern. If the UK government makes decisions from a UK perspective on changes in regulations that impact in Northern Ireland, and again, that can affect actually how we trade with that dual market access. There's a lot of issues there. I said the public finances, and then lots of issues around housing and infrastructure be a really big concern for me. That the fact that we have these aging assets and we've got no money to try and do something to transform them. So those are the kinds of things I think that they're not long term. A lot of them are they need addressed now.
Thanks, Maureen. Gareth, I'll come back to you. I have 2 more questions. What percentage of the increase in job numbers was due to part-time gig economy jobs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I can't give a percentage off the top of my head, but 2 of the charts that I showed, one was the strong growth in employees post-pandemic and the very significant reduction in self-employed post-pandemic. And I think that gig economy jobs are part of that picture where people who, the Uber and Just Eat guys, where historically a lot of those guys were self-employed, and we've seen then a lot of people transfer from self-employed status into employees. Some of that's been driven by government regulation and tax and changes to tax code, which I'm sure many people listening will understand, where self-employment is less attractive from a financial perspective than it would have been, say, 5 years ago. So certainly I think there certainly has been some movement of people who were 5 years ago self-employed. They're now have employed status, but they're actually probably doing more or less the same job.
Yeah. Okay. Conor, I might just bring you in there in terms of your quarterly forecasts. Do they have any insights about the labour market?
Yeah, so there's 3 points I would say in terms of what we were projecting in terms of the labour market. So the first is that we expect the rate of jobs growth to slow as we go into this year and next year, and that largely reflects the conversation we've had here around increased pressure on business costs resulting from the increase in taxes. I think from a sector perspective, it's probably mimics what I said in terms of output. So your business services sectors being among the strongest. Interestingly, in the recent data, the construction sector in Northern Ireland has seen very strong employee jobs growth. What I would say is that we think growth will be a bit more modest in your consumer-focused parts of the economy because they tend to be more labour-intensive and, a bit like Gareth said, tend to have relatively lower wages, where the increase in employers' national insurance contributions and the national living wage has a larger proportional impact. I think the other point that I would make is around our forecast for unemployment. So look, I caveat this by saying we still think it's going to remain very low, but we do think it's going to start increasing over the next couple of years. And I think what's interesting here is that Northern Ireland's unemployment rate is at historically low rates at the minute of under 2%. And a lot of this can be explained by the conversation that we've had on economic inactivity. So our employment rate would also be much further below the UK average, as our unemployment rate is too. Economic inactivity is the difference effectively whenever you're thinking of the two of those. But I think if we look at Northern Ireland's historical unemployment rate, and if we look at unemployment rates across other advanced economies in the world, I can't really think of any where you have one with a consistent long-term unemployment rate of sub 2% or even close to 2%, really. So I suspect that we may start to see some degree of normalization upwards in the unemployment rate as we move forward. What would be interesting, and I think if we do start to see that, we'll need to monitor closely, is just the composition of that. So actually, if what we were seeing was people moving from economic inactivity into unemployment, that might suggest people coming back into the labour market. You're unemployed if you don't have a job, but you're looking for one. You're economically inactive if you don't have a job and you're not looking for one. But I think that unemployment will start to nudge upwards as we go through this next couple of years, because I'm not convinced that these kind of 1.6, 1.8% unemployment rates are what we would see prevailing in Northern Ireland over the longer term. Certainly isn't something that international evidence or historical data would suggest this is a steady state for this economy.
Thanks, Conor. Okay, I've one more question in the Q&A. I'm thinking it's probably for Gareth, but if anybody else wants to jump in. So just if there's any other questions out there, this is probably your last chance to add them into the Q&A box, please. So the question is, do you see potential tender opportunities for public sector contract work likely to focus more on real living wage rather than national living wage?
Yes, is the short answer to that, and we're already seeing it, where the health minister, well, last year now, announced that people working in the adult social care sector were to be paid the real living wage as a minimum rather than the national living wage. I think it was the Southwest Trust or the Southern Trust, and then that was to be then scaled out or obviously implemented across all the trusts in Northern Ireland. So I think, yes, it's certainly the direction of travel that the health minister has indicated that he wants to move in. But obviously that needs to be aligned with additional funding for the organisations that are bidding for those contracts. And indeed, one of the points that I was talking about in respect to the voluntary and community sector, without additional funding being made available, there is an increased risk that the voluntary community sector, who are bidding for those contracts at the minute, will step back from bidding for health and other public service contracts in future without additional funding.
Okay, thank you. That's it. I've no further questions. Gareth, Conor, Maureen, thank you so much for your time. We've had great engagement there on the call today, and we were justified in extending it to the hour and a half because it's 1 minute to 2. So thank you again, and look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future. And thanks to everybody on the call for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.